I had just finished grading a mountain of essays when I noticed him hesitating at the classroom door. Jacob, one of my more reserved students, held a notebook tightly to his chest, his eyes darting like he didn't quite know if he belonged there. "Can I, stay after class for a minute?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. There was something about the way he asked that made me nod without hesitation. The room had settled into that familiar quiet that comes when everyone else has left, leaving just the faint hum of the overhead lights and the soft scratch of pen on paper. I motioned for him to sit, and he did so cautiously, almost as if he expected me to change my mind. "I'm having trouble with the last few problems on the homework," he said, sliding the notebook toward me. I leaned in, and instantly I could feel the tension radiating off him. It wasn't just about math or literature or whatever subject we were tackling. It was deeper, an unspoken worry, a sense of not being quite good enough. I smiled softly, trying to ease him, because I knew that moment mattered more than the homework itself. We worked side by side, our heads close together over his notebook. I explained a tricky concept, and when his eyes finally lit up in understanding, it was like the room shifted. The silence between our explanations grew comfortable, intimate even, filled with small gestures. A hand hovering for guidance, a shared laugh over a stubborn problem, the quiet satisfaction of progress. Then he said something I wasn't expecting. "You know, I've never had anyone explain things to me like this before. You really get it." I froze, the pen hovering over the paper. It was a simple sentence, yet it carried a weight that left me unprepared. There was honesty there, a raw sincerity that I couldn't just ignore. I found myself smiling, not in a teacherly way, but in a personal, connected way that surprised me. For a while, we just sat there, looking at the homework, but I could feel the current between us, a quiet acknowledgement of something more than just academics. There was respect, yes, and mutual understanding, but also an almost startling recognition of our own shared humanity. He wasn't just a student in need of answers. He was a person, and I was reminded, gently but firmly, that I could be more than just an instructor. By the time the clock nudged toward evening, the homework was done, yet neither of us moved immediately. There was something in the air, a lingering thought neither of us wanted to rush. And then he said softly, almost under his breath, "Thank you for really seeing me." That line, that simple acknowledgement, left me speechless. I had offered help, yes, but what I received in return was a quiet revelation. Sometimes I realized helping someone isn't just about guidance. It's about presence and attention and allowing someone to feel noticed. As he finally closed his notebook and stood, there was a small mutual smile that said everything we couldn't yet put into words. Walking home that evening, I kept replaying his words in my head, the weight of them settling gently, like a quiet truth I hadn't known I was waiting for. The next afternoon, I found myself thinking about Jacob more than I expected. It was strange, almost unsettling, how his simple words, the "thank you for really seeing me," kept echoing in my mind. I knew I had to check in, not just as a teacher, but as someone who genuinely wanted to understand him. When the bell rang and most students had already filed out, Jacob lingered by the door again. This time he seemed a little less hesitant, a little more grounded. "Do you have a few minutes?" he asked. I nodded, motioning for him to sit, and I noticed how the late afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, dust motes dancing in the golden light. It made the room feel warmer, softer, almost protective. He opened his notebook, but this time he didn't dive straight into the homework. Instead, he leaned back slightly and said, I wasn't just struggling with the problems. I've been feeling a bit lost lately. Not just with school." His eyes looked down, tracing the edge of the desk, and I could feel the vulnerability radiating off him. I listened, really listened, letting him speak without interrupting. There was something in the way he opened up that made the room feel smaller, more intimate. Each word he spoke felt significant, weighted with honesty that demanded attention. And I realized that our connection had shifted. What had started as tutoring had become something more, a shared space where trust could grow. We began to work on the homework eventually, but the silence between explanations was different now. It was comfortable, yes, but it also held a subtle tension, an awareness of each other's presence in a way that was almost electric. Jacob's hand would sometimes brush mine as he pointed to a tricky problem, and we both noticed it. We didn't pull away, and somehow that small acknowledgement of closeness made the afternoon feel monumental. Then he said something that stopped me completely. I feel understood with you, like I don't have to hide the parts of me that confuse others. His voice was soft, almost hesitant, but steady. I looked at him and felt a swell of emotion I hadn't expected: protectiveness, empathy, and a deep, undeniable connection. The afternoon light shifted as the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the floor. Jacob closed his notebook slowly, almost reluctantly. There was a silence that wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken feelings and mutual recognition. I realized that this moment, fleeting as it was, had changed something inside both of us. When he finally stood, he lingered at the doorway, looking back at me with a small, shy smile. "Hi, I'm glad I stayed," he said quietly. And just like that, the tension, the vulnerability, the connection, it all settled into something quietly beautiful. Walking home that evening, I felt lighter, but also aware of a growing anticipation. Something had started, subtle and gentle, but I knew it had the power to shape both of our lives in ways we hadn't yet imagined. And I realized, with a soft smile, that helping someone sometimes means giving them space to be seen, and letting yourself be seen too. The following week, something had shifted between Jacob and me. It wasn't dramatic, nothing anyone else would notice, but I felt it the moment he walked into the classroom. He carried himself with a quiet confidence now, yet there was still that same gentle hesitancy when he approached me after class. "I finished the homework early this time," he said, placing his notebook on the desk. But it wasn't just about the homework anymore. His words, his presence, carried something heavier, something unspoken. I nodded, smiling, sensing that he wanted more than just academic guidance. We sat together, heads bent over the problems, the late afternoon light spilling through the windows, warming the room in golds and ambers. I could feel the subtle tension building, not uncomfortable, but alive, like a quiet current moving between us. Each glance lingered a fraction longer, each brush of his hand over the paper sending an unexpected warmth through me. "Do you ever feel like no one really listens?" he asked suddenly, his voice low and hesitant. I looked at him, really looked, and I saw the layers of vulnerability beneath his calm exterior. "I feel like I've been invisible sometimes, until now." I reached over, almost instinctively, and placed my hand over his on the desk. It was a brief, grounding touch, and he didn't pull away. Instead, he looked up at me, and in that moment, words weren't necessary. The room, the soft hum of the overhead lights, the golden dust motes in the sunbeams, they all became part of this fragile, intimate connection we were building. We continued working, but the conversation shifted to life, hopes, fears. Jacob spoke about his dreams, the pressures he felt at home, the quiet loneliness that often accompanied his days. I shared small pieces of myself too, not as a teacher, not as a mentor, but as a human being willing to be open. There was laughter, and sometimes a pause where the air seemed too full to speak. And through it all, I realized that what had begun as homework help had become something profoundly human, a meeting of two souls willing to be seen. Then, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, Jacob spoke again, voice barely audible. "I don't know how to say this, but I trust you, more than I've trusted anyone in a long time." His words hung in the air, delicate and fragile. I felt my heart tighten, a mix of surprise and a deep, warming affection that made my chest ache in the most unexpected way. The moment stretched between us, long enough for both of us to realize that what we had was rare, delicate, and precious. He finally closed his notebook, but instead of standing immediately, he lingered, eyes meeting mine with an intensity that left me breathless. "I'm glad I stayed after class that first day," he said softly, almost shyly. And I knew, in that golden evening light, that neither of us would ever see that moment as just homework help. It had become a bridge, a quiet, unspoken bond that neither of us could ignore. Walking home later, I felt a strange mix of exhilaration and reflection. The connection with Jacob had opened something inside me I hadn't felt in years. It was tender, fragile, and thrilling all at once. And I knew, as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, that this story between us was far from over. The days that followed were quiet, almost sacred. Jacob and I found ourselves lingering in those moments after class more often, not always speaking, but simply being present with each other. It was a rhythm, a gentle dance of trust and connection that neither of us wanted to disrupt. One late afternoon, the classroom bathed in the soft, honeyed light of the setting sun. Jacob slid his notebook across the desk to me, but this time it wasn't about homework. He met my eyes, and there was a calm certainty in his gaze that left me both nervous and exhilarated. "I wanted to tell you, you've changed the way I see things," he said, voice low but steady. "Not just school. Me? Life." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken meaning. I felt my chest tighten, not with anxiety, but with the weight of the bond we had formed. I reached across the desk, placing my hand over his. It was simple, grounding, and entirely filled with understanding. "You've changed me too," I whispered, "more than you know." We talked then, not about assignments or grades, but about everything else. Our dreams, the quiet fears we rarely shared, the parts of ourselves we kept hidden from the world. There was laughter, and sometimes silence, full of its own kind of intimacy. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly seen, just as I had helped Jacob feel seen. When he finally stood to leave, there was a gentle hesitation. He looked back at me, eyes glimmering with emotion. "Thank you for being here. Really here," he said. And just like that, the air between us held everything we hadn't been able to put into words: trust, connection, respect, and a subtle, undeniable affection. I watched him walk down the hall, the fading sunlight catching in his hair, and I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not just for the moments we had shared, but for the discovery of something rare, a connection that transcended roles, age, and expectations. It was a reminder that sometimes the most profound lessons aren't found in textbooks or assignments, but in the simple act of being present for another human being. That evening, sitting by the window with the quiet hum of the city around me, I reflected on everything that had unfolded. I realized that helping Jacob had changed me in ways I hadn't anticipated. It had taught me patience, empathy, and the courage to embrace vulnerability. And in turn, it had allowed him to trust, to open up, and to see himself in a new light. As the stars began to twinkle in the sky, I felt a calm certainty. Some connections, fleeting or enduring, leave a mark on your soul. And the one I shared with Jacob was exactly that: subtle, tender, and unforgettable. Sometimes the quietest moments teach us the most. And that day, that week, that unexpected friendship reminded me that true growth, emotional, personal, and human, comes from connection, respect, and the courage to really see someone and to let yourself be seen.